this is Nick.
And this is Graeme.
And welcome to the Dude, Where's My Code podcast.
So I know we usually release on Mondays. It was Canadian Thanksgiving this past weekend. Had a little time away with the family, so that delay is totally my bad. But we are really excited to get this new format of, video and proper audio out to y'all.
Yeah, so I think when we recorded before, we were on the fence about whether or not we were going to be putting out episode 4 or 3. So it turns out we are going to end up scrapping what we had for episode 3. We're going to go back to that topic after, though. I think we're both really passionate about it, and there's a lot to cover for that, probably, honestly, in more than one episode. So, what you have coming up right now is going to be episode 3 officially, and we're pretty excited about that. It's on metrics, which is a pretty controversial topic, I think, but we get into it, talk about, the good, the bad, the terrible.
Yeah, just a chance to chat out, how you measure teams, individuals effectively, hopefully effectively. And in a way that just benefits, the individuals, the team, and the organization, which is kind of what we all want, right? Like win-win-win.
Absolutely, yeah. So different aspects on how to look at it, how you can kind of gauge if you're performing well in your own metrics, right? So metrics for your metrics almost. But yeah, it's a pretty cool topic. We're both passionate about that. We both like looking at data to kind of drive the decisions we're making. So we thought it was a pretty good one. So thanks for tuning in. Hope you enjoy, and we'll see you around.
Let's get into it.
Hi, and welcome to the Dude, Where's My Code podcast. I'm Nick Cosentino. I have Graeme Harvey here with me. This is episode 4 for us. It potentially will be episode number 3, depending on how much we like it compared to episode 3 that's already recorded. So if you've been listening or watching, and it kind of just jumps from 1, 2 to 4, this is episode 3 or 4. So we'll see how it goes. But yeah.
Yeah, we're really hoping that this starts to demonstrate a commitment. So anybody who listened to a couple episodes, liked what we had to say, but was like, I don't know about the quality of this. Right. I hope that those people can stick around now, knowing that we are willing to invest and make this, what it deserves to be.
Yeah, we got fancy mics and stuff here. Got a little one of these guys. It's a little filter. I'm pretty pumped about it. So it's definitely going to be better than the headset mic.
Yeah, you sound great.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. But yeah, so Graeme and I were, as always, we're kind of chatting a little bit before this, and one of the conversations we were having was about looking at how you try to measure how a team is being successful and the people on that team, and how you can measure if they're like being successful. So part of that is kind of looking at trying to get quantitative, right? So how do you actually measure things versus just having like this gut feel of like, yeah, we're a team, we're doing stuff, it feels okay. Yeah, I got some engineers and other roles on my team. Yeah, they're doing good, things are okay, but what does that mean? Like, how do you actually measure that kind of thing?
Yeah, and quantitative metrics are hard. They're just generally hard. And then you bring into the mix individuals' soft skills, individuals' contributions to the team, like complex relationships, and it gets really difficult. And yeah, so how do we find the right balance there?
Right, and I think something that probably comes up for most people is they hear metrics, they hear things like that, and it's like, it's scary, but like, why is it scary, right? Is it like some history that you have bad metrics that were in place that were making you feel like, classic example is like, I don't know, we're talking about lines of code, right? Another example, it's probably, I think, Graeme, you have a funny anecdote, but like more recently, like basically measuring screen time for your mouse moving and stuff like that. Like that's not so great.
Yeah, it was just last week that I heard about the Amazon undetectable mouse jigglers for $30 Canadian. I haven't put one to use yet, but
right.
If we need little mechanisms, it's probably a bad metric.
Right. Yeah. So you're basically just completely trying to game a system with a metric that's like probably totally false for measuring how productive someone is, right? Like if most of your job is actually, I don't know, like analyzing things and reading through stuff and or being on calls. Like, is your mouse actually moving that much? Like, I don't know. Maybe, but
it'll be fun to get into the complexity and nuance of this. I was having a conversation not too long ago, and I said, if we were measuring commits or open pull requests or whatever
sure.
it is, our staff engineers would look like the worst developers we have because they spend so much more of their time helping others,
right.
Writing proof of concepts that never really see production light of day, pairing, right, drawing systems diagrams and architecture diagrams, all these things that don't factor into how many pull requests is this developer opening metric.
Right. Yeah, no, that's interesting, right? And I think we chatted before about like even, roles, and as you gain seniority, like a lot of the time, even if it is an individual contributor role, like you become a little bit less hands-on because your influence, your scope of influence is growing, and that often means that you're having less like hands-on contributions, even if it is like an IC kind of role. So yeah, the metrics that you would use to like that might seem like obvious things, like how, I don't know, how many lines of code an engineer turns in or how many pull requests that they complete, like maybe aren't the best ones.
How many bugs a tester found.
Right. Yeah.
There's another temptation in metrics that can be a bit of a trap when we start trying to pit teams against each other and we start looking at metrics and applying them across teams. And I know there's definitely some desire to do that. And I think in some cases that does make sense when you find the right quantitative metrics that represent the behaviors you want. But you have to remember that every team has a different makeup and behaves differently. The classic poor application of this is the like sprint velocity metrics. Right. Like, what's this team doing? 30 points per sprint. Okay, we expect all teams that are operating well to do 30 points, but points don't mean anything to anybody except an individual team. And any desire to compare those things is just a wasted effort.
Right. Like, look at this team over here. They're doing well, and maybe they are based on some actual useful metrics, but like they have 40 story points per sprint. Hey, team A and B, like, why are you not doing that? And then the team goes, well, sure, we can do that. But even if they're not consciously thinking of it, what probably happens over time is you adjust how you're making up those story points, and maybe you double your story point output because you've doubled your estimations. Like, it's the wrong thing. Like, it's the story. In this case, the story points are relative to a team that's cohesive and consistent, because even the same team, you rotate out some people or you have some vacations, suddenly like those story points don't really line up anymore.
Mm-hmm. And since we're talking about it, in this particular case, right, sprint, like commitment to achieved ratio is actually a much better metric to potentially look at across multiple teams in an organization, where you can look at each team and say, for what they commit to do in a sprint, how much of that are they actually achieving? And that goes both ways. You can say they're accomplishing 120% of their commit. Okay, well, that sounds a little bit like sandbagging to me. Maybe we can stretch out or whatever. Or it can say like we're hitting 50% of our commitment. Okay, why are we overly aspirational? Like, why are we under delivering on what we think we can? Whatever. And then and I think this is going to get into, for me, the core about using these metrics is, why are we seeing what we're seeing? And so for me, you can talk about metrics as a stick to beat with or a carrot to lead with. Sure, and I think every metric that we measure, or at least that I measure, is a start of a conversation. It's an opening line to a question or to an exploration. So
I like that. Okay.
50% sprint commit to achieved ratio. Okay, well, the question is like, why aren't we able to deliver what we think we can deliver? And it's not hey team, you're 50% as efficient as you should be. Like, get more work done. It's actually, hey, what's going on? Are there more interruptions than usual? Like, has our understanding of complexity of what we're building changed? There's a lot of things that we could explore to figure out the root cause, and then start to try and eliminate those and figure out what changes we need to make to put the metric in
I like that, because it's interesting, because if you take that approach and you do the opposite, where it's like, okay, you're 150%, I would think that my gut tells me the reaction shouldn't be, hey team, you are the most amazing ever, you got 150% of target, like, and there might be cases where this is the case, and that is awesome, but that wouldn't be the question I would want to ask. I think the actual purpose of that commitment and trying to hit it is to get 100%. It's to actually measure how accurate you are at your forecasting. So it's your proximity to 100%, not how much you're swinging above it, and that's the carrot, and how much you're swinging below it, and that's the stick.
Right. In our team's case, or the teams that I have led, I'm thinking of an example team actually
Sure.
back from Circle and not at One Build, but in many of the cases of teams I've led, we're trying to optimize for predictability.
Sure, yeah.
Right. Not like if you reach for like absolute maximum output, chances are you can hit that, but you might not be able to sustain it.
Right.
And so you have kind of this roller coaster up and down of what can be delivered. What we would rather find is a consistent, predictable pace, so we can say to our product owner, that's this many items away, that's this many points away, this many sprints away. And that's a pretty reasonable representation of when we would be able to get to it. If your velocity is all over the map, how are you going to be able to say when it's coming?
Well, then I think that's a really interesting point, right? I think if I reflect on interactions with, engineering teams, project or product managers, depending on how your org's set up, like, there's this classic thing where you have the product side of the world is like, hey, like, just do more things, just fit in more stuff. And then you have, engineers pushing back, being like, we can't do all this work. And it's this give and take kind of relationship. But I think ultimately, when you have a good relationship between product, project, whatever you want to call the role that's not specifically just engineering, more of the scheduling and the work that has to get done. I think when you have a good relationship that way, it ultimately does come down to predictability being the most beneficial part. Because if you're like, Graeme, to your point, if you can cram in a bunch of stuff in a sprint, like, it's not going to be sustainable. And so okay, then product is going to say, cool, you did that this time, like, I want that next time, I want a little bit more next time. They're always going to want more. That's okay for them to want more. It's just that's not long term what both sides will probably want to strive for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're just coming off many months of cramming to get a new release out the door. And the interesting thing is, now that the release is out or on its way out, resetting our expectations of what a reasonable pace is.
Right.
So understanding, and it's actually difficult because we don't have that baseline now. We don't actually know. We have a tainted view of how much we can deliver. We know what our maximum is, I think. I don't know how to know it's the maximum, but we know how hard we can push. But I don't think that kind of thing is sustainable. And so, since we're talking about metrics, we should be looking at metrics beyond just maximum output to try and figure that out. So, I think I mentioned in the pre-conversation with you about balancing metrics. And for me, that's a really good one, is like, even if you're asking teams to push, there's a crunch time, whatever. We all have been there. We all have them.
Oh,
we also need to figure out what we can measure, to make sure we don't suddenly burn the entire team out or lose the entire team. So you can get into talking about measuring, team member, developer, engineer happiness. You can confidence in the code they're writing. There's actually quite a few indicators of whether we're happy with our pace or not. So
interesting. That's cool. Like, I think I'm thinking back, there's way too many examples to even try to list them off, but like, just situations where it was a crunch time, right? And I've been very fortunate, Graeme, we've been on teams together, but I feel like I've been fortunate in my experiences where it's been cool to see people rally together and like have this common, like, we're going to get stuff done. And it's really cool. And I can say this too, because I was also writing code and contributing, not just the manager at the time, but like just being part of like this huge rally, and it felt awesome. But yeah, like, was our work capacity like way higher momentarily? Yeah, like, absolutely it was. Was our quality where it needed to be? I would say probably early on, like, absolutely not. Did we get better at trying to gauge that? Yeah, but like, it's still like you're making a bit of a trade-off there. And I would argue that at that time, like, we absolutely weren't measuring that type of thing. But we felt it. And we felt it because we were pushing really hard, and then we would be pushing hard to fix the bugs that we were landing. And then again, not measuring, Graham, to your point, like how engaged were people? How were they burnt out? Like totally, like not even on the roadmap. And it was not great.
Yeah, and you're dancing with something here that is, I think, really core for me about metrics. That the situations that you're referring to, at least some of them, I know about. I was there. We
Sure.
had some
Yeah.
real heavy crunches in early Magnet startup days.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what's
and
really
just to interrupt for a second, I don't think when either of us talk about past work experiences, like, yeah, these were crunches. Yeah, they were hard, but like, I don't know. I probably wouldn't trade it for the world. It was awesome, but they weren't easy.
many of them I would willingly choose to do again. So
Yeah,
I mean, I look very fondly on those times. And that is a whole thing. Someday we'll maybe talk about the
sure, yeah.
startup versus enterprise.
Yeah, would love to.
Personalities that you may need to be, or characteristics that, anyway. But yeah, and so what's really fundamental about this, and what I know existed at Magnet, is this level of trust, right? And I think metrics work really well when you have the trust of like the team members, the people around you. They have trust in the leadership, potentially even above you, if we're talking about who's looking at the metrics or using them. And so we can say, hey, like, we're measuring whatever. Let's say we're measuring bugs created. We shouldn't be, but let's say we are. I think the team trusts that in a time of crunch, they can say, hey, like, we can't just power output features and expect that we're not going to have bugs, right? So we trust that, like, even if that's a thing that we are monitoring, and it's hopefully not the only metric we're monitoring,
right?
It might go up. And we are not going to get in trouble for that, because it is well understood that we've been asked for something that is kind of in direct competition with that particular metric.
Right. And I really like this, actually. So I want to come back to like this idea of trust around metrics, but specifically to this point too, like something I find very interesting is when we have metrics that you might have situations where you're measuring something and there's a period of time where you're like, we want to focus on this because we want to drive this number to be to some goal. That's great. And there might be periods of time where that same number, you're like, we just want to monitor it and make sure it's like, it's just kind of like a health check, right? Like a signal that tells you things are okay. And I think it's really neat that that you can kind of go between that, where you might set goals and you might be hyper focusing on pushing hard or something, and like you're the thing that you're trying to get out of that is like productivity, like however you measure that. And then the bugs, like if you can have a conversation and be like, hey, look, like we have this call it a signal. We have this signal that tells us our number of bugs created is going up. Cool. Like in my opinion, what you shouldn't do is go, hey, engineering teams, like shame on you, you're doing so bad. It's more like, okay, this is something we can learn from. What are we doing? What changed to make that signal go up? Oh, we started pushing really hard. But we've been pushing hard for 2 months and we just saw this bug thing go up. Okay, like interesting. What can we dig into that's showing like this lagging signal spiking when the only change was before? I don't know. Like it's just really neat that you can use metrics to kind of lead into investigations. And you said this earlier, they start conversations.
And it's a perfect opportunity to apply balancing metrics for exactly what you're talking about. If we did want to try and push our output, we might choose to also look at our quality measures, whatever those measures are, and watch for when our output has gone up. What does that do to those quality measures? And if they go down, that doesn't always mean, okay, oh, we better back off the output. Right. It could mean a couple of things. It could mean, hey, quality is slipping a bit, but it's within tolerance. Or it could be a really interesting chance to say, hey, what might we change to bring that quality metric back up without impacting the output metric that we've moved?
Yeah.
So whatever that might be, right? Like better automated processes, or, like more checkpoints, or whatever process changes you want to make. And my hope is, if you're at least in an agile environment, that you can attempt to experiment with those changes, see how they impact the metrics, and then either adopt the changes or throw them away, right? Yeah. I love telling my team that anytime we try to change a process, it's an attempt at a change, and we'll see if we like it or not. That's why we run retros, and we're not going to just say, okay, this is a thing we do now, regardless of what the outcome is.
Yeah, suck it up and buckle up, and you're part of the bride now, and no looking back.
Yeah, that's it. And we'll just go change something else and like, you know, mess with things further and just never have a nice equilibrium.
What's the flavor of the, you know, of the week for changing things on the process, right? Yeah. Like,
yeah. What do I feel like messing up this week?
Yeah. But I think it's cool. Like I basically don't tell people that I like Agile anymore, not because I don't think Agile is useful, but I just like focusing on the continuous improvement part of what I think Agile embodies. But I like to say continuous improvement because to me that's suggesting like you want to identify changes, you want to try. Personally, it tells me I want to be able to measure if those changes are successful. Yeah, I think that's really interesting, Graeme. So you're basically, when you're in positions where you can make those changes, and then measure like the impact if they were successful or not. Might hear some dogs barking. I apologize.
Yeah, I think you know, one of the more frustrating situations I have been in as a manager is being at organizations that, you know, tell us the metrics that they care about. Or maybe it's not even the specific metrics. Maybe it's the characteristics of the individuals in the team or whatever they want as an organization. Fantastic. That sounds good. But then you also start getting these other like rules or like things put in place that are very concrete. The best example I have is when I had a team perfectly suited for, you know, like a Kanban, or if you want to get really technical, like a Scrum Ban style, you know, working style, perfectly suited. And I think by all metrics, the team operated very well this way, right? No one could point at anything that was not working well. But for the sake of standardization, we were expected to move our processes to a more specifically Scrum process. Because the organization wanted to orient around Scrum processes and have that be a standardization, mostly for reporting, consistency, and in some of our organizational processes. But at the end of the day, it really did have an impact on how the team worked and the metrics that, you know, we already were doing really well at. So that can be very frustrating when it's like, hey, you need to maximize for these things. Here's how we're going to measure them. Oh, and by the way, here's like the parameters you're not allowed to touch. And then it kind of paints you into this corner of like, okay, well, what do I do? Just yell until people start doing the thing I want? Or like, so.
I don't know. Has that strategy worked for you?
Not even on my dog.
Yeah. So I think I like Kanban metrics, and I think you were kind of talking a little bit earlier, and I wanted to bring up the trust thing again. I think when you have metrics that a team can use and kind of think about internally, I like that when you have a team that's autonomous, they can look at what they're measuring. They know why they're measuring these certain types of things. And coming back to trust, like you trust that everything's with best intention. So if you wanted to drive a particular Kanban metric, like your, you know, your work in progress, your velocity, whatever it happens to be, like, are there ways that you can game those things individually? Sure. But like if you're doing it to drive team efficiency and the team's bought into it, I think it's really powerful that that people, I basically trust that they're looking at those things, trying to drive the improvements without going like I'm gonna cheat the system so it looks better. Like, but it does take understanding what the metrics are actually supposed to be used for, and this level of trust. And third, the autonomy, because to your last point, Graeme, if you start to lose some of this autonomy, it kind of makes it tricky to go, okay, like we see where there's some gaps or we want to try changing something, but if you don't have the autonomy, like your hands are tied. So what can you do?
The context is just so important all around. And that probably helps relieve some of the fear that measuring metrics brings, right? It is a two-way thing. The trust, like, hey, you know, individuals on the team need to trust that me as the manager are not measuring these things so that I have, points to come yell at the individuals for, or things to point at to tell the team why they aren't doing good enough or need to do better. I also have to trust them with, okay, best intentions. I don't think anybody on my team is going to try and game the metrics. I hope not.
Did they just split up this story into 50 work items that are going to take them 10 minutes so they can go, hey, look how amazing these particular Scrum or Kanban metrics look like?
I love that example. This example has come up multiple times.
Awesome.
As like an example of gaming metrics. And I love it because anybody who wants to game metrics that result in smaller items being shipped, like, do it. I have at it. I think that's hilarious because it's amazing. It's actually a behavior I want. So maybe some gamification isn't even bad.
Fair enough, yeah.
But it is like, it's assuming best intentions. It's being able to trust the team with the context and say, here's what we're trying to accomplish. Here's the metrics we think we should measure. And hopefully there's an openness where the team can say, well, maybe that is a bad metric because here's this thing you didn't think about. Why don't we brainstorm, or jam as a team on metrics that might reflect the thing we're trying to measure? And yeah, just that two-way trust, I think, is what gets us in a spot where our metrics start to become the prompts to further exploration or to a story that we're digging into together.
I do like that, especially because like a lot of what we're trying to chat about too is like from an engineering manager's perspective, right? Like we've been on both sides of this, but it's kind of, I would say it's your responsibility as an engineering manager to be able to articulate the reason why you want to be measuring certain things so that people understand, and they can, like Graeme said, like you can trust that, you trust that you're not using it as some way to like come back at the employee and say like, hey, like you were off by one story point this sprint, so like, sorry, you're not getting promoted ever. Like it makes people feel safe. And again, just always comes back to trust. But I wanted to pivot this a little bit, Graeme, because I think trust is important. And I think what we're talking about is so far kind of sounds like teams that are jiving pretty well, right? I don't think personally, I haven't had a team that from day one, they feel that they can do this effectively necessarily. Now, aspects of it, sure, right? Like if you want to talk about, hey, we want to start measuring how we can be successful about things, I think that's, possibly you can start that early. But if we're talking about Kanban or other things, like, do you have any thoughts about, like, if you're taking a team that's kind of come together, and maybe not necessarily new employees or something, but like working together for the first time. If we're thinking about things like Kanban or Scrum, they don't really have that work experience where they know like, okay, like the work items are going to be sized approximately this way, and we know we can split this work up. They're not really gelling yet. When it comes to try and get metrics and stuff put together and really start this process of like, cool, like we want to start measuring things. We want to see if we can start improving. Like, do you have any thoughts about like what it takes to get a team there where they can start building that trust, they can start measuring? And I'm like totally putting you on the spot, but I was trying to think about this as you were chatting, because I was like, I actually don't know if I have like a really good example of like, oh, like you follow these steps or something. So I was curious if you can think about a team more recently where it kind of was just happening and like felt good and natural.
I don't know if this answers the question exactly.
Sure.
We'll see. I mean, I think there's a couple things for me. One, above all else, I've had some metrics conversations and done some metrics webinars. Those topics actually a little near and dear to me. But one of the recommendations we always made was like, just start measuring. Like just start. Everyone always wants to talk about like, ooh, like that'll be hard to measure. Or like that might have some nuance, and it's like, yeah, that's fine. Or like that's not a perfect metric. I'm like, great, it's probably not. Let's start, and just like start getting something so you know where you're at. You can't. There's no way that you can impart change and understand if that change is successful or not if you're just not measuring things. Right. But rolling back to like, is it an early team, and then how do we start establishing some of these foundations? Something I do with my team, this steps a little bit outside of the metrics conversation.
Sure. Okay.
And actually, if anybody's listening from my current team, we haven't done this yet, and I've been at the company for many months. So
get ready, because it's coming.
This is going to have to happen before too long. But I really do believe in like team charters, where the team gets together and really defines that charter together. Not only is it a really cool team building, trust building exercise where people get to know what's important to each other and gets everyone aligned. But we talk about capturing, a team mission, team vision, sure. And then team values are my most favorite part of that. And I believe that the team should work together to understand what do they value as a team? What things are they not willing to compromise on? And under what circumstances might those things be willing to, some of the values be willing to flex, or processes be willing to flex? And so what this does is it gets everybody aligned around what's important for us as a team.
Right.
And one piece of that framework helps give people a decision heuristics or like a decision oracle if they're missing anybody who could help them. So they're alone.
Starts to build in that autonomy to individuals, right? Because they have a reference point to start looking at and say, this is what our team would do. So maybe I should steer this direction.
To the point where I tell people, if you have to make a decision with no other assistance and you make it in line, or at least in a way you believe is in line with our charter and our values, it's not going to be a wrong decision. In that, It's either the right decision, it was in line with our values, or it didn't really have the outcome we wanted, and it's not a decision we would like to make again. We should reassess our charter and our values to understand how we could adjust for that. And so that's not specifically metric related, or it's not metric oriented, but it is kind of metric related in that as we're thinking about establishing those early metrics, we can kind of use the values of the charter to help guide. What do we care about, right? What do we want to measure? What things do we not want to compromise on, such that can we measure that to make sure we don't negatively impact that, or we know when we do?
So you don't go through that exercise and like the outcome of that is like, oh, we're going to hook up to this system and we're going to get these signals. It's actually like your starting point for even framing up how you would have that next conversation about like, what can you measure? Like, just start, right? Like, it's giving you that basis for it. Yeah, that's definitely, I think that's actually like kind of answering my question for me, right? It's like when you're starting from say nothing, like how do you get to a point where you even start picking things to measure? And the way you framed it up is essentially like have an agreement with like, get on the same page for what's important. And I guess I wanted to ask this question back to you. So when you're coming up with something like a team charter, and I get that this isn't like, we're talking about metrics, the team charter isn't giving you the metrics, it's kind of setting it up. When you're saying like what's important to us as a team, is it fair to say that it's not just like internal team values, but like almost like a business prescribed mission and how that's interpreted for the team?
I hope the team knows their mission, prescribed by the business, right? Like, I
didn't know how to say that properly, but I think you know what I mean, right? Like,
why do we exist? Why are we here together in this space? What are we setting out to do?
Like so metrics.
That to me is the mission, and the vision is like, what does it look like when we do the thing? That what's interesting about this exercise, I did this early in my time at Circle, and I came in with this, what I now view as a bit of a naive perspective. And it was like, okay, I'm going to let the team define all of this. I mean, I kind of helped define the mission and vision. That makes sense. In terms of the values, it was like, it's all on you. What do you all want as values for our team? And I'm not here to steer any of that, or to in my mind at the time, maybe taint any of that, right? Like, y'all are the team. But what happens is everybody brings their past experiences, which is a very positive thing, right? You get everybody's kind of mix of good and bad from their previous positions. But you have to be there as the leader to kind of guide where do we want to go? Because you're going to get a lot of conflicting. Presumably, you've hired or you've been given team members who are reasonably aligned on ways of working, but you're going to get some kind of like conflicting ideas. You're going to get people. This is kind of like a little bit stereotypical, but like sometimes juniors haven't learned what to care about yet, so they kind of care about the wrong things.
Sure. Okay.
It's kind of funny. As a dev of many years who's been through startup and large organizations, you'll get like sometimes people care a lot about like code organization and naming conventions, and you're like, yeah, that stuff's important, but also like it's not. We don't like. We don't have any code yet. Like we have 2 files, it's fine. You know, maybe when we have 5,000 files, we'll talk about folder hierarchies and whatever. So being able to
that's an interesting one.
like those kinds of things, and everyone's going to have an opinion, and it's whether like this is capitalized and is this camel case and how deep is too many folders and like whatever, all of that, like, you know, bike shedding of values. And so as a naive manager, I went through that a few times where eventually I learned, no, as a manager, like I'm here because of my past experiences, and I kind of know what I want for this team, and I want everybody to provide input and direction and work in a culture that they want to work in. But you can help pick which things are worthy of becoming values in a charter.
I've heard you describe this before, though, like when we talk about basically leadership, and even for ICs, right? Like as you're growing with experience, like I think you framed it as like reducing chaos, right? Like you're going to have all of these perspectives coming together, and part of your job is to basically start getting some alignment, reduce the chaos so there's less noise, and that way you can like really start steering, like getting the team to kind of rally behind something kind of common and filter it down.
Yeah, fantastic throwback. That's
there we go.
push aside a bunch of the bad ideas, park and let them for later, prioritize. Yeah, totally.
Because the folder structure thing might come back up later, and it's not like, hey Jimmy, that was the worst idea ever. It's like it's just not, it might not be relevant right now. We are literally not making any money, and if we want to stay employed, we can't worry about the folder structure right now.
Right.
As an example.
And that in of itself actually starts to define a value. We want to deliver things of value and make some money before we spend time building the perfect solution, whatever.
Okay, that's pretty interesting though. So yeah, the whole framing of that question was like getting a team to start rallying behind coming up with what's important to them. So I was thinking back to like a particular team that I was managing. Actually, Graeme, you were on this team, so
sweet.
What's interesting about this team, so this is back at Magnet, one of the things that I thought was pretty cool about it, so we've been talking a lot about like I guess if you're thinking about like Scrum or Kanban, some of these metrics that are associated with like productivity, and I wanted to share a bit of an experience that was I think like an abstraction of that almost. Like we didn't necessarily look at like, are we breaking apart the stories, and like are we getting the right work in progress and the right velocity, but something like we had a lot of autonomy on this team, which was awesome. I think that was something that when I reflect on, like I think without that this would not have worked. We had a super high degree of trust, which is great. Again, I don't think we could have operated this way without it, but we weren't actually looking at some of these metrics we've been discussing. I think what we started doing was we realized we had like features that we were delivering in the software that almost kind of felt experimental. And when I say experimental, I don't mean like we want to see which way the user clicks necessarily, although that's interesting feedback for us to gauge like, how people are navigating the software. We actually had situations where, given the scope of what we were trying to cover in our features, it would be physically and like financially impossible for us to go exercise every possible scenario. So we were like, we have a pretty good idea and we're pretty confident. And some of the things we would measure, like how do we feel that we're pretty confident? Well, we have particular types of tests that are building up that confidence. So it wasn't necessarily like, lines of code covered, but like we had a culture on the team, almost like, I guess you would call it like some values that kind of came out naturally that we would literally write tests on like absolutely anything we could. I think early on, especially, like we had, coming back to trust, we had such a good relationship between like the engineering side and the testing side. We could like Graeme, when you were testing at the time, we would turn to you and say like, try it out, and you'd go, hey, like this is broken, cool, test written. And we could even turn to you at some point and say, hey, Graeme, here's this feature if you want to give it a shot. Here's all the tests for the scenarios that like you probably don't have to go exercise, because, and you would trust us that we had them covered. So I think that was interesting.
So just, I think you're going somewhere with this, but just interject for 1 second. There's a metric that I have recommended people try and measure for their teams. One of my recommended metrics, and it's actually code quality confidence.
Oh, okay.
Have not figured out the greatest way to measure it yet, but instead of talking about code coverage might be an input to code quality confidence, right? Yeah. Depending on how much we have covered. But there are probably many other inputs to our confidence about the code. And that's a really nice measure to have. It actually informs a lot about the way teams are working and how individuals are potentially feeling about the work they're doing, how engaged they are. So yeah, I just think that's really cool that we were doing that on that team years before I realized that was actually something worthy of being captured.
I would love to come back to this. I think when we have, I don't know, like if you're going to dig into that more, I would love to hear more about that, because what I realized, what I started doing recently when I talked to people about testing, which you and I could go talk for a long time about this, I started describing like test coverage as confidence. I'm like, people that work with me know that I love talking about unit tests, and that's great. I try to, because I over-index on that, I try to say, by the way, there's other types of tests too. I'm sorry that I keep talking about it.
There's at least a few.
There's at least one more. So I often come back to saying like, you know what, like if you're delivering this change, how confident are you in it? Like that's really what it's about. The tests give us confidence in our changes. And it's a nice abstraction to say confidence, because how do you want to define that? Well, that might be unit tests, that might be integration tests, it might be, Graeme could list a million more. But anyway, I think that's a super neat one, and to be able to quantify that confidence would be super cool. Did you have another thought on the testing part?
No, carry on.
Cool. Okay, back to my rambling. So I thought the testing part in particular was kind of neat, because I just wanted to highlight that that's like a solid example of a trust relationship in the team, right? Like both engineers and testers could tell the other role about like, I've done this part for you, or like if we missed it, I wouldn't be like, oh, Graeme sucks for finding a bug. It's like, cool, like together we're working on building this confidence. But something else that was really cool about this was that because we were aligned on like, we want to have coverage over these scenarios, and we have this situation where we know we can't possibly cover everything ahead of time, we actually used a lot of telemetry. And the telemetry would guide us into areas that we knew we wanted to improve on. And there are definitely numbers involved, but I don't think when I reflect on it, I don't think we had it down to like a science where it was like, we tried doing this, right? We would talk about like success rates of things. We want to drive that success rate. We had situations where we broke the reporting for it, and it was like, oh, success rate's 100%. And we're like, I can tell you it's not. So like that was us like accidentally gaming a metric. So the idea was like, it was less about, we want to achieve high success rates, but we don't just want to look at that number, because we knew, even from our own experience, we trusted ourselves enough to know that number alone isn't quite right. It's not like an oracle, like Graeme, I love that word you use. It's not like the oracle of truth for this. But what we could start to see is if we broke down that success into like the different pathways that people went down, like we could start saying, hey, it looked successful for option A. I'm using option A here not to mean like a UI option you click, but a scenario, because we would have potentially thousands of scenarios that we'd have to consider. And we might not even know all of them by the time we collect the metrics, but we could start to build out this like view of different scenarios that got exercised and start to establish confidence in those. And the team was empowered to go back to product and say, cool, how does this feel? and we'd work with product who we had a good trust relationship with, and we could have the autonomy to steer where we needed to go. So I wanted to bring up this example because I thought it felt really good to navigate. It felt like we were being successful in what we were delivering because we had autonomy, trust, and we could pivot.
And now that we're talking about it, having been there,
mm-hmm.
I know I think this was actually kind of unspoken. I think we had an unspoken metric. And I don't know what the metric would have exactly been if we had written it down. It would have been basically, we want zero uncaught exceptions in the application, right? We want every path to be covered. We never want a user to get an error that we didn't control and say, hey, something happened. We think you could try XYZ to fix it, or else it's like unfixable, but we want control over that. And so what that meant is we kind of had this value tied to that metric where whenever we saw one come in, someone would look at it and be like, oh, wow, that's interesting. And then it would be like, okay, we're going to go change this, change it up, make sure that scenario can't happen again, and then drive that number back down to zero. So, I mean, cumulative, it was obviously never going to be zero, but maybe if you had this rolling, maybe for every release, our target is zero uncaught exceptions. And then what happens is one goes out, it's got a new feature, something bad happens, and we immediately kind of fix that and roll that into the next one. It was this ongoing thing. I don't know, being a more mature person, being in an engineering management position now, it's interesting to look back on, because I don't think we spent a lot of time talking about that stuff. It organically happened. It worked. That's the luxury of a small, high trust team and a small, fast moving organization. But I look at some of that and think cool, how could we have dashboarded some of that stuff and formally talked about it? We obviously didn't need to, but it would be,
I think, we almost unified, you said it, in an unspoken way, almost we all rallied behind this. It's almost our charter kind of just was almost unspoken, because we didn't we might have tried to make a charter formally or something at some point, but I don't think it would have been, with the exact same intentions or anything. But yeah, that exception thing in particular is a really cool example. And I can remember feeling anytime we had some uncaught exception, it almost felt it felt dirty. I was like, oh man, we're letting people down. It's embarrassing. And it didn't matter if I coded it, if someone else in the team coded it, didn't matter. There was no blame, but it was we just want that number to be low. And we had the tools that we needed to have it happen. So that was really cool. We had that autonomy, we had the team trust built around it, and we could drive that iterative cycle around improving it.
And I expect, when I think back on it, there were many situations where we were in a hurry to get a new feature out or a new workflow out, and we would do that. That's good enough to go out. And I think that kind of number of uncaught exceptions would definitely go up.
Yeah.
And then we would slow down, address that, adjust, start looking for gaps and well, how did this happen? It was there was a lot of discussions about testing gaps, because those, whether it's automated or manual, right? How many varieties of devices we needed to test against, and all the different scenarios, and how do we put the best things in place to catch these earlier so we can continue to drive that number down while shipping these new experimental features that we want to get out. So.
And you totally reminded me of something that you said earlier, and I'm glad it kind of just came up again. But you were talking earlier about when you have a situation where you have, say, two metrics that maybe are a little bit contrasting or competing. And let's talk about going back to productivity, however that's defined, the amount of stuff, the amount of value you're delivering, let's say, and quality, right? I mean, quality is baked into value. So I'm framing this wrong, but say the amount of stuff you're delivering versus the quality. One thing that you said was cool. What if you start to think about maybe not trading them off? If you want to bring that quality bar back up, what could you do? And I wanted to come back to this because I think it's super interesting from an engineering perspective that what you've essentially done is you've added one more constraint. You've said, cool, go this fast. Cool. One more constraint is don't drop your quality.
Mm-hmm.
Now engineers get creative. And I think that's totally awesome because people go, well, you can't just go faster and have higher quality. And it's like, I don't know, what can you do, right? Well, we don't have tests that cover this kind of stuff. Well, why not? Well, the system doesn't support that. There's no framework. Okay, well, if we had a framework, what would that look like? Well, it might look like something like this, but we don't have the hardware to go run it on. Okay, well, how much does that hardware cost? And you just back to opening up this door about having conversations and getting thinking about how you might solve these problems. Like the metrics start to drive that.
Right. So maybe before we close, we talked a lot about team metrics, productivity metrics, right? Delivery metrics. But individual metrics is a thing too. And most people on the teams that I've been with want to set goals as an individual, right? They want to measure something around their abilities so that we can look for opportunities to grow, highlight the things that are working well, and help foster growth, and have this like material, quantitative measurement and evidence that they're doing the right thing, right?
Right.
And so I don't know, like when you think about individual metrics, how that factors in. I think I suspect the individual metrics all kind of play a part in whether the team metrics are good or not. But there is kind of that individual element as well, which isn't as much about the team delivery as it is an individual's ability to contribute and to grow on the path they want to grow on.
Right.
I don't know. Is this something you do? Do you struggle with it? Is it easy? Do you have any like tips?
Yeah, no, I think this. So, to be quite honest, like this is probably something I struggle with, especially getting to like a quantitative perspective. So, for a little bit of I don't know context, like currently the teams that I'm working with don't follow necessarily like I would say, are we agile? Yes, agile enough. But we don't have like
Says who?
yeah. Says me. I'm the manager. No, but like I think we have the things in place that we need where we can deliver and we feel okay. But this is why this is a really good conversation, because it's like, well, what's okay? What's good? What could be better? How do you measure it?
Mm-hmm.
So when it comes to individuals, though, I more recently for sure, like at Magnet Days for sure, I could say if someone was like an engineer and they're like, hey, like if they wanted to relate their progress or their ability to be successful and relate that to like the team pieces, I think it was a lot more tangible, like to have numbers and say like, I don't know, like you want to be able like for the space room, we want to support X many types of things. And they're like, hey, like I've only been like historically able to do like one a month or like two a month. Like it'd be nice to like to do more. And like, I think there were more tangible quantitative things in that domain for me personally. Now I would say that a lot of the conversations I have related to like people growing at least, and this is the difference, and maybe this is a bit of a nuance, like it's less about how productive someone is in a quantitative measure and more about like kind of setting goals for career growth and things like that. And I feel like they're a lot more qualitative, like making sure that they have exposure to certain types of projects and stuff like that.
Right.
So that's been more of my focus. So it doesn't quite line up with having metrics. So this is like certainly a challenge area for me.
Right. There are tools out there designed to measure individual developer productivity. I've seen them. I've used them. There's a couple pretty big names in the space. And it's
do they revolve around like mouse movement on a screen?
Similar, not. Often often they pull in metrics from integrations with like GitHub if you're using GitHub, Jira if you're using Jira, whatever, and they apply their kind of heuristics to crunch the numbers, and they'll give you raw numbers, and then they'll also give you some contextual information about cool. We've parsed this and whatever comparative. You can compare it to other people on the team, whatever. So there's huge potential for abuse there, which I think is why there's so much resistance to these tools. And what's interesting to me, the first time I got introduced to one of these, I think it was called Git Prime, and then I think it got purchased by Pluralsight, and now it's Pluralsight something Flow. Can't remember.
Pluralsight
Flow Prime. What we did, which was really cool, I thought, was went to the ICs on our teams and said, look, we're using this tool. Let me show it to you, right? Let me show you the metrics it's collecting on you. And we could say together with the individuals, like, look, there is a dashboard here where I can click and see the number of PRs you opened last week. I can see the number of comments that you left on other PRs. I can see whatever. But explaining to them that no individual number, any number we can pluck out of there isn't going to be meaningful enough for us to use in abuse, right? To like, hey, do better at this thing or this thing. This tool had a view that was probably the only piece of the tool I actually really used. And they tried to plot on a 4-quadrant chart where they thought the individual was in terms of, hey, they've made a lot of commits, but it's in the same places, right? So they would put that individual in like a high churn area. You could say like, hey, they haven't really had a lot of commits. Like, it seems like they're kind of lagging, like what's going on. And what's really interesting about that is in the hands of the wrong person, sure, right? They can go and in an aggregate say like, you're not delivering enough, or like, why are you spending so much time like reworking things? Rework is bad, right? That's a problem. But what I loved about it was I could go to an individual and say, look, like the metrics say you're kind of in the churn quadrant. Are the requirements not clear?
Right.
Are you struggling with the implementation of the ask, right? Are you afraid to ask for help and you're kind of like testing like different hypotheses? Like, what's going on?
It's a conversation starter, right? You're not beating the person with the stick.
Right. Yeah, it's exactly that. To be able to say, hey, I noticed that you haven't made a lot of changes in the last week. Oh, that's right. You're working on an architecture design diagram and document and proposal. Like, why
you
would
were
you
on vacation?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Great one. You did paired programming for a junior engineer all week, and they were the ones making the commits. Whatever. So it is interesting to me that started from a place of trust when I did use it. And actually, I liked that for that conversation starter so much, I pursued potentially using it in other places and was met with heavy resistance by developers who had been at workplaces that had used that tool or similar tools the wrong way.
Right.
And I couldn't even get traction with pursuing a tool like that to help me have conversations, help ICs, because even though we had a strong level of trust, the abuse prior had been so stark that they wanted nothing to do with it. So that's the warning, the potential risk areas of this. But I would say for anybody listening who is struggling with this concept or this topic, that's probably my number one recommendation, is like establishing that trust, having a high level of transparency of the metrics and what they're being used for, and then proving it. And the proving it is to be able to come to someone who, whose metrics don't look great and say, hey, I see you're struggling. Like, let's talk about it. What's going on? And if you don't have any information to understand what's going on, like, why is this happening? What can we do to help? It is for me, in my opinion, the correct starting point. And from there, it opens the door to really creative brainstorming sessions about discussing together, like what y'all want to accomplish, what kind of metrics the team member, the IC, might want to see put in place, right? So that they can measure their productivity, their growth, or whatever they're targeting to measure.
Yeah, I think that's really neat. It's like a shame that, and it's hard, they can't blame people, right? It's a shame that when they have like personal experiences where they're like, look, like, no, that was bad, I'm not going to be in that again. Yeah, like that would be really crappy. Try to pick my words here. It's really crappy to be in a situation where you're like it comes back to the mouse moving thing, right? Like, I'm gonna have to sit at my desk and move my mouse. So much so that I can't even code enough anymore because I got to get those mouse movements in.
Right.
So
forget all your shortcuts.
Yeah, like, got to move the mouse now, which is okay. I'm a GUI person, so anyone who's a command line person, sorry.
Yeah.
Got to get with the times and get a mouse jiggler. But yeah, okay. So Graeme, like that's a good reflection for, I think, like especially for like personal metrics. Trying to think if I don't have a good takeaway for the personal metrics. Just because I honestly think that's an area that I have to improve in. Because right now it's mostly qualitative.
Man, I start a lot of my like intros with new team members, whether I'm getting like a new team or I'm someone's joining my team and we start doing our one-on-ones. My first one-on-one almost always starts with, "Hey, listen, I suck at goal setting, and it is actually my responsibility to work with you on goal setting. And it would be irresponsible for me to sit here and act like I know what I'm talking about, and then set goals with you and help you achieve them by like motivating you to do that, and like, you know, working with you when you're not achieving them, because frankly, like I'm bad at it. So it's always a, hey, let's grow through this together. Let's figure out how we can
I love that.
Set metrics for each other. Because like yeah, should I be better at it? Probably, as an engineering manager.
No one's perfect, right? So
yeah.
No, I like that.
Yeah.
I was trying to think of a good takeaway from the rest of like the, you know, like the team side of things. And I think something we hit on a lot was trust. I think having trust, autonomy when it comes to metrics, because when you have those two things, I think it basically negates this situation where people are trying to game metrics. And even if you're thinking about, gaming metrics when you're going cross team kind of thing, like maybe you're reporting that metric to a stakeholder, how do we make sure we're not gaming it? Well, if you have a high degree of trust, you're probably doing the right things, right? You're not trying to game it to go, look, we're doing it, haha, like we're tricking them. That's not a good trust relationship.
Right.
So I think those two things are really important. And something I just wanted to add on that Graeme said earlier is really like start measuring stuff. I personally think when you have zero metrics, any metric, even if it's rough, even if it's hard to measure, is probably going to be better than going with nothing. At least you can start to get a signal. Try to pick something that's irrelevant at least, but like, you know, having something that's a little bit relevant is better than having nothing to gauge decisions on.
Right. Pick the top thing that you care about, value, and try and measure it, and then go from there.
If it's hard, that's cool. You'll get better. So, awesome. Yeah. Any other last thoughts, Graeme?
I think we covered a pretty good range there of the different types of metrics. There are many more, but you know, it's just a good kind of touch on the subject. I think a lot of the same concepts apply across many metrics you might be seeking to set or to try and like work towards. So yeah, I don't know. I'm interested to see if others have positive or negative experiences or responses to some of the stuff we've shared.
You're going to have a ton of people in the YouTube comments, because we got tons and tons of comments rolling in, but you're going to have all these people flooding in now to say, hey, Graeme, I don't agree with how you're measuring my productivity with my churn area, and they're going to hunt you down.
Good news is I haven't had that many direct reports in my career that can, I think I could take them.
Awesome. Okay. Cool. No, like if people do have feedback on that, if you're watching on YouTube, definitely leave comments. We'd love to hear your perspective. And with that said, if you're on YouTube, if you want to like the video, subscribe to the channel. If you enjoy the content, it lets us know we're doing the right thing. And if you think we're not doing the right thing, leave the comment. Let us know. We're definitely engaged. We want to hear from you. So thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. And we'll see you next time.
Ciao.